Brian, you're here again. You must have watched everything I've done, Brian, over the last 3 weeks. So hopefully give Mark a minute and he will be with us. Ah, Dave. How was your game of golf today? First day out. Excellent, excellent. Oh, Ali's here. Aha. Mark's here. Let's see if we can. Ah, brilliant. Brilliant, Mark. I'm so glad you could we could arrange this and get on and have a little chat.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Very good.
I thought that.
Yeah, it's this earpiece thing here.
Oh no.
Never quite know if I have it set right.
Yeah, I can hear you. I see you and hear you perfectly tonight. And I
Great.
thought,
Oh, I see Stuart Morgan there.
yeah, there's a few people who were like, there's one person who said, "Oh, can you record it? Because I can't get on." I was like, "Oh, okay." He must be
Sure.
desperate. But I thought we could have a chat about the whole strokes gained, where it came from, how it, and what we can learn from the statistics part of the game these days, and how we can, almost how we can, I want to say modify it to think about how it could apply to, the golfers that, we work with as well, as opposed to the guys on the PGA Tour.
Yeah. Well, we can, take, whatever direction you want to go. I'll try and follow you. But I think one big misconception is that strokes gained is for pros. Strokes gained is for amateurs as well. And I use it with amateurs. There's now we have an app called Golf Metrics that amateurs use, that mini tour players use, college teams use, high school teams use, and just regular weekend golfers use. And there's a number of other apps that are out there that are similar, different in some ways. But the idea is amateurs can benefit from strokes gained in the same way that pros can. And in fact, amateurs have a lot more room to improve. So I think tracking their game is even better and a little bit easier than it is for pros, because pros are just fighting for fractions of a stroke here and there, and it can be really hard to see exactly where those are. Whereas for amateurs, you can get a pretty good read quickly about where they are and where they need to go to achieve their goals.
And could you give me a bit of a background as to, because some people have said to me, well, how stroke gain's calculated, or where did it come from? And I think, we hear the phrase strokes gained all the time, but obviously Yep. Some people don't probably understand exactly what strokes gained is.
Yeah, so it's after doing this for a while, I probably have 3 or 4 different explanations, and I also have the 15-second explanation and the 5-minute explanation. But I think many people realize that traditional stats were flawed. Counting fairways is flawed because you could miss a fairway by a yard or you could miss it out of bounds. And those are very different, but they can't both count as a missed fairway. You could miss a green in regulation and you could be on the fringe of the green, or you could be in the sand, or you could be in the water, and they all count as a missed green in regulation. So just counting things doesn't give you a clear picture of where a person's strengths and weaknesses lie. In fact, it can be, it's actually even not worth it, I would say, to record that kind of information. When you look at putts, you would often hear announcers say, "Oh, he just chipped that to a foot," and his putting stats are going to improve because he took one putt instead of taking, two or maybe three. And it's like, well, putting performance is not supposed to be measured by how well you chip it. Right? So counting putts, when you count a one putt from 1 foot, the same as you count a one putt from 30 feet, that doesn't make any sense. And everybody sort of knew it didn't make sense, and they knew that if you missed a lot of greens and you were chipping it close, you would have fewer putts than somebody that was hitting greens in regulation and had 20, 30, and 40 footers and took more putts. You're comparing apples and oranges. So just counting putts doesn't make sense in the same way counting fairways, counting greens in regulation doesn't give you much insight. And so if you look at putting, the simple insight is sinking a 30-foot putt is a better performance than sinking a 1-footer. Okay, so but how much better is that? How much better is sinking an 8-footer than sinking a 1-footer? And it's a simple idea, which is you measure every shot relative to a benchmark, a baseline, or an average. And so for PGA Tour pros, they average 2 putts from 30 feet. So if you take 1 putt from 30 feet compared to the PGA Tour average of 2, you've gained a shot. From 1 foot, PGA Tour pros average one putt. So if you take 1 putt when everybody else averages 1 putt, you haven't gained anything. And then at 8 feet, well, PGA Tour pros 1 putt half the time and they 2 putt half the time. Their average is 1.5, and they rarely 3 putt. So if you 1 putt, or if a tour pro 1 putt from 8 feet, 1 putt is a half stroke better than the 1.5 average. So a 1 putt from 8 feet gains a half a stroke. And so you can measure every shot relative to this average, and that tells you how much you're gaining relative to an average player, in this case an average PGA Tour pro, but you can measure yourself relative to, say, a scratch golfer or an 80 golfer. You can choose the benchmark however you want, but what you don't want to do is say a 1 putt from 1 feet and 8 feet and 30 feet are worth the same, because they're not.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, in the way old-fashioned stats worked, 2 putt, 3 putt, 1 putt, your putting stats could be brilliant based off the fact you haven't hit any greens. Exactly.
And like I said, everybody knows this, and when I describe strokes gained, everybody, oh yeah, that makes sense, because everybody knows. It's not counterintuitive. If I tell you, here are 2 shots, which do you think is the better shot? Strokes gained will reflect that. So if a person from 180 yards hits their tee shot to a foot versus hitting it to 30 feet, well, you know which one of those 2 is better, right? So all things being equal, closer to the hole is better. All things being equal, it's better to be on the green than in the sand if you're the same distance away. So you can also look at greens in regulation and see, in a simple example. So moving back from putting, suppose you have a 180-yard par 3 where the average is 3 shots. And this happened at TPC Scottsdale a few years back. 3 players birdied this hole in the same round. 1 player hit it to 30 feet and sunk the putt. The other player hit it to 8 feet and sunk the putt. And the other player hit it to 1 foot and sunk the putt. They all recorded a 2. They all recorded a birdie. And in fact, they all gained about a stroke on the field, because the 2 where the average is 3, they all gained a shot, but they did it in very different ways. Whereas if you look at greens and putts, they both had 1 green in regulation and 1 putt. It looks the same. But if you look at it from a strokes gained viewpoint, the player that hit it from the tee 180 yards away to 30 feet gained 0, because he went from 3 strokes away from the hole at the start of the shot to 2 strokes away from the hole at the end of the shot, and he took 1 stroke to do it. So if you take 1 swing of the club and you get 1 stroke closer to the hole, you haven't gained anything. So his strokes gained on the tee shot was 0, his strokes gained on the putt was 1, and that's how he gained a stroke on the field. the person that hit it to a foot gained 1 stroke on the tee shot because he went from 3 strokes away at the start of the shot to 1 stroke away at the end of the shot. So he's 1 better than the average. And the player that hit it to 8 feet, well, he started 3 strokes away. He ended up 1.5 away. So he gained a half stroke on the tee shot and a half stroke on the putt. So that's generally how strokes gain works, is you look at how far away are you from the hole at the start of the shot, not in terms of yards, but in terms of average strokes to hole out. And you see where does that go at the end of the shot. And if you've gotten a stroke closer, you're average with the baseline. If you hit a 320-yard drive in the fairway, you're going to go from, say, 4 strokes away at the beginning of the stroke to, say, 2.7 at the end. And now you've gained 0.3 of a shot because you've hit a long drive into the fairway. So that's the general way that strokes gain works for every shot, is how much progress have you made to the hole, measured in terms of strokes, not in terms of distance. And that's why, you know, when people say a 300-yard drive counts the same as a 1-foot putt, yeah, well, they're both one swing of the club, but that's not the right way to measure it. The right way to measure it is how many strokes closer are you getting to the hole.
Okay. And what information then does a player have to record in order to be able to calculate that?
So there's basically two ways to go about it. One is with a GPS kind of device in your club or your phone, and the other is sort of manual tracking. But it is really quite simple. The player needs to record how far away are they from the hole, and what condition is their ball. Are they on the tee, fairway, rough, green, stand, deep rough, recovery shot?
Yeah.
So if I play a hole, unfortunately I have my phone, so I can't show you at the same time. But it takes about 10 seconds to enter information for a hole. So I might start 400 yards away on the tee. Then I hit it to, let's say I hit the drive 250 into the rough. So now I'm 150 yards away in the rough. So I enter 400 tee, 150 rough. I put it into the sand, so I'm 20 yards sand. I hit it to 3 feet, and I sink the putt. So I put in 20 stand, and then 3 feet green, and then I'm done. And literally, when you press buttons, it takes about 10 seconds. And so I tend to do it after I complete a hole, and I'm walking to the next tee, or I'm on the next tee waiting for somebody to tee off. So by the time I leave the 18th green, and I finish my round, it takes me 10 more seconds to get a report on the entire round. Because I'm not slowing down the round. I'm just using the 10 seconds that you have somewhere in the midst of a hole. And so it's very little information to enter to get the most important feedback at the end.
Because I think that, you know, when you look at normal statistics on the way it's been done over the years, you'd have, well, I did hit the fairway, yes or no, cross, tick. How far did I have in? 170 yards. Did he hit the green? Yeah. But the problem is, you could aim down the left-hand side of the fairway, so you get the right angle in, roll into the semi-rough and class it as missed fairway. And then all you would do is go, well, how many fairways did he hit? 6 or 10. How many greens did he hit? 14. You know, but it's not telling me anything, because I could have hit it anywhere. You know, I'm not.
Oh,
absolutely. It's not categorized in terms of the quality of the shots that I'm hitting to actually gain shots. All I'm doing is calculating a number.
Yeah, and you know, for amateurs, you know, the big miss is, say, hitting a tee shot out of bounds. The strokes gained for that is -2, because you're starting the third shot at the same place you started your first shots. So you're 2 strokes worse off, and you haven't made any progress to the hole. Whereas if you're on a par 4 and it counts as a missed fairway, that missed fairway, if you hit it 300 yards and you're in the rough, Well, that might have cost you 0.2 of a stroke because you're in the rough instead of the fairway. Hitting one out of bounds costs you 2 strokes. It's 10 times worse.
Yeah.
So if you just say I missed the fairway, you're missing out on the most important, part of that, which is, missing a fairway. Hitting a 300-yard shot into the rough isn't so bad. Hitting a 100-yard, a 300-yard drive out of bounds cost you 2 strokes. And strokes gained figures that out, and it gives the player immediate feedback. So it's not just what happened at the end of the round, but you can go back and look at the strokes gained for every shot. And there's many players that learn a lot when they see, gee, I'm 100 yards in the fairway. I went for that pin tucked on the, put it in the sand. The strokes gained for that is really quite negative. So from 100 yards, your goal ought to be to hit the green, and if you hit the green, you're going to gain strokes. You put it in the sand, and you're going to lose, 0.3, 0.4 strokes, something like that. It's a bad shot from 100 yards to put it in the sand.
That is quite interesting for a player's perspective to realise that you're not losing shots by hitting the green, because some players go, oh well, they all hit it to 5 foot when they play, or if I don't hit my wedge shot inside 6 foot, I'm not playing as well. Have you come back, Mark?
Expectation management is really important, and from 150 yards in the fairway, PGA Tour pros don't hit it to 5, 10, 15 feet. They're 20 feet or further away. And they go, well, how can that be? Well, if you see the highlight reel, it looks like they're hitting these great shots, but hitting the green for an amateur for sure from 150 yards is gaining a lot of strokes compared to most any other amateurs, and even for a pro. That the PGA Tour average from 170 yards, 180 yards is over 3. So if they have 3 strokes to get down from 170 or 180 yards, they're gaining a little bit on the field.
People just don't realise that. They presume they hit it inside 15 foot all day.
No, they hit it inside of 15 feet when they go for a par 5 and 2. They just missed the green and they chip it to 5 feet. Well,
yeah, that sounds about right. And when you look at this, I mean, I always think you get players at all levels who tend to get stuck because they don't realise which part of the game they need to improve to get better, or they don't actually realise what area of the game they're weaker at, or what area of the game other players are better at. Is there things that have been discovered through strokes gained that go against almost what we thought was actually happening?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things, and I think they're fairly well known now, but they might not have been. But it's one of the misconceptions was lay up to your favorite yardage. And so this happens for pros and amateurs, but let's just take pros for an example. If you gave a pro on every par 5 that they played the ability to place their ball 80 yards away in the fairway after their second shot and then play the hole in from there, or you took the PGA Tour average on par 5s, who would score better?
Say that again, sorry.
So the two options are, as a PGA Tour pro, you can take the PGA Tour average score on par 5s.
Yeah.
Or you can pick up your ball from the tee on a par 5, walk ahead so that you're 80 yards away in the fairway and you're hitting 3. Who's going to score better over the course of a season? The person that gets to play every par 5 from 80 yards in the fairway after 2 shots, or you just take the average score on par fives?
Probably the average score.
The average score will beat it dramatically. And what does that tell you? That laying up to 80 yards, you're going to be losing shots. If you place the ball 80 yards away in the fairway on a par five, you're losing a ton of strokes to the field. And this sort of goes with the notion of closer is better than further. And you're much better, even if you don't hit the green, being 20, 30, 40 yards, even though it's sort of this in-between wedge shot, than it is to be 80, 90, or 100 yards. And there's a few qualifications to that, but the main ones are you don't want to go for the green in two and put it in the water.
Yeah.
You got to take out. You have to take out situations like that. But on average, so over a long period of time, it's always the case that closer is better. And there's some amateurs that say, yeah, but from 30 yards, I'm likely to hit it fat or scull it over the green. And so I'm actually better from 80 yards. And I say, that could be true for you. But what it tells you, or tells me, is you need to work on that 30-yard shot because you should be better at that than you are from 80.
And you know what? I think there is that conception that, lay up to give yourself a full shot in.
Yeah, so there are exceptions, and there are the exceptions for the better players typically. And for example, if you've got a bunker in front of the green, and the pin is tucked close to the bunker, and the only way that you can get your shot close is to go beyond the hole and spin it back. Well, that might be hard to do from 30 yards, and it might be easier to do from 80. If you're a pro, and you can hit it very accurately with spin and suck it back. Most amateurs, that's not the case. So I won't say, there aren't exceptions, because there are exceptions. But as a general rule, being inside of 30 yards is a ton better than being at 80, 90, or 100 yards, whatever your quote, favorite distance is. So the notion that, I hit my sand wedge 82 yards, so I'm going to lay up to 82 yards. Well, first of all, how many people lay up to 82 yards and not 77 or 85? And then once they're there, even if they were at 82 yards, how many people really hit their shot 82 yards where it lands relative to the pin? I think if PGA Tour pros aren't that good, I don't think amateurs are either.
And Mark, just lately there's this big thing on driving distance and obviously accuracy, and people now hitting it 350 yards. And I see articles where they'll say that the driving distance is a direct correlation with where they're finishing on the leaderboard. How many shots, if you hit a ball 350 yards off the tee with good accuracy, let's say, how many shots are you actually gaining?
Yeah, so here's a way I like to explain that. Take Roy McIlroy as an example, but you can replace Rory with Bubba Watson, Dustin Johnson, and some other sort of long and pretty straight hitters. So Rory, say, is about 20 yards longer on average per drive, and that includes some of the par fours that might be sort of layups, hit a hybrid because there's trouble, or the fairway narrows, or it's a dog leg or something like that. But so not every hole is a driver hole, but over all drives, Rory is about 20 yards longer than the PGA Tour average. Each one of those drives gains about a tenth of a stroke, which is, a tenth of a stroke doesn't sound like much, but it's also shows the value of strokes gained. You've got to measure these fractional gains and losses. So what happens is it's a tenth of a stroke per drive, and if there's 14 of those on par fours and fives, he's gained 1.4 strokes in a round because he's 20 yards longer per drive.
Okay.
But he's not as accurate, right?
Well, I was going to say, if you start missing fairways at 350.
Yeah, that's right. So the penalty for missing a fairway is about 0.3 of a stroke on the PGA Tour, which is significant. You compare being in the fairway to missing a fairway. 0.3 of a stroke is a lot. I mean, it's like worth three of these 20 yards longer drives. But Rory misses about one more fairway per round than average. That puts him at the bottom of the accuracy list, but he's only missing one more fairway per round. So the 1.4 strokes he's gaining from distance, you now subtract 0.3 that he's losing for accuracy, and he's gaining 1.1 strokes per round.
Wow.
4 rounds, that's 4.5 strokes better because he's longer and almost as accurate as PGA Tour average. And the other key is he doesn't hit any more into penalties than anybody else. So if there is extreme trouble on one side of the fairway, water, out of bounds, whatever, he's not hitting any more into penalties than anybody else.
Wow. That's unbelievable. So how do you, if you were looking at Rory or these guys, right, how are they gaining the shots then? How are they gaining the shots that, is it just relative to them, or is there a correlation in scoring to where players are gaining most shots the weeks they win or they're successful?
So, Rory is gaining, and DJ and Bubba, they're gaining more than a stroke around by being better drivers. Yeah. In their entire game, Rory is about 2.5 strokes better. So he gains from his approach shots, and he gains a little around the green, and he gains a little bit in putting. So he's about 2.5 strokes better than PGA Tour average. And in order to win, he needs to be about 3.5 strokes better than PGA Tour average. So per round in order to win. So Rory, for him to win, he has to play about 1.5 strokes better per round than his normal game in order to win. So he has to sink another putt here or there. And so what tends to happen is you see the best ball strikers, more often than not, are at the top of the leaderboard. And the one that has the hot putter tends to win. And that's not true every week, and there's definitely many, many exceptions. But ball striking is very consistent, especially driving, because it's not like all of a sudden somebody wakes up and they can hit it 30 yards further than they were before. Rory's weapon is a weapon just about every week, just about every round. Whereas putting sort of comes and goes. There's a lot of variability there because, you have a 50% chance of sinking an 8-foot putt. So if you have 10 8-footers, PGA Tour average is 5. Well, you sink 2 more out of 10. You sink 7 instead of 5. Well, now you just gained 2 strokes. You just, shaved off 2 strokes. And that's why the winners of PGA Tour events tend to be the best putters that week out of the group of the best ball strikers over the season. So you take a look at the top 10 of the official world golf rankings. They're almost all great ball strikers. Why do they win so much? Because one of them gets hot and they win. There's not too many players in the top 50 in the world that are only great putters. In fact, to be in the top 10 in the world, it's not enough to be a great driver, a great ball striker. You have to be really good at 3 out of the 4 areas, where driving, approach shot, around the green, and putting, those 4 areas, if you want to be top 10 in the world, you pretty much have to be really good at least 3 out of the 4, and maybe average in the 4.
And what are you actually gaining in them 4 areas? If you want to be top 10 in the world, what would your driving, iron play, what sort of strokes gained numbers would you be looking at?
So I think of it more in terms of percent, and I can do the math here. But I would say, driving counts about 20%. Let's say 25%. Approach shots about 40%. Around the green, about 20%, and putting about 15%. So instead of going through all those numbers, the best players gain about 65% of their strokes with ball striking, so driving and approach shots, and about 35% with putting and around the green shots. And so if somebody is one stroke better than PGA Tour average, then it would be typical that they gain 0.65 strokes with ball striking and 0.35 with better putting. And the surprising thing is that breakdown applies to amateurs as well. If you want to take 10 strokes off your score and you look at a typical golfer who shoots 90 versus a typical golfer who shoots 80, where do those 10 strokes come from? Well, about 6.5 from shots outside 100 yards and about 3.5 strokes inside 100 yards. There's not too many golfers who shoot 90 that could become 80 golfers just improving their putting. It's just not possible to get 10 strokes better by improving their putting, or any one particular area. You can't get 10 strokes better by just improving your driving. But that breakdown, like I said, it's not just for tour pros. It's very similar for amateur golfers as well.
But the benchmark that it was initially created off was tour players.
Yeah, but I also look at amateur golfers, and for amateur golfers, I typically look at a scratch golfer benchmark.
Yeah.
And so I can actually look at 80 golfers versus 90 golfers using all the data that I have for amateur golfers. So I literally mean if you compare a 90 golfer to an 80 golfer and you use the 80 golfer as a benchmark, where are those 10 shots? Well, typically, 6.5 shots are from ball striking and 3.5 shots are from and putting. That's a general rule, but the reason I think it's important for amateurs to measure their game is that everybody's a little bit different and has different strengths and weaknesses, and somebody may be, a relatively poor putter, and they should work on their putting because there'll be more to gain there. Somebody else might be relatively poor around the green, and so they'll have relatively more to gain there. So I know, for instance, there's a lot of players at my club that are a little bit older that are just fabulous with the putter and around the green, and they're losing more than 6.5 shots because they've lost distance off the tee. And if you're hitting a 5-wood in from 150 yards into a green, it's hard to hold a green.
Yeah.
With a 5-wood. So you can certainly have a golfer who shoots 90 and is different, is a great putter, even worse as a ball striker. So it's really an individual thing. And so that 65%, 35% split is sort of a generic average of a bunch of players.
And if you had, let's say you tried to use this in either older people or juniors, and you were playing a par 4, and they can't get to the green in 2. So it's going to take them a good driver, another good, say, fairway wood, before they've got a wedge in the hand. How do you calculate the effectiveness then?
Still, strokes gain works. And like I said, it's actually remarkable. I have records of some junior golfers from when they were 9 and 10 years old to when they, went off to college, and you can see this incredible improvement in their strokes gained, and a lot of it just comes from, they start off hitting their drives 150 yards, and then 175, and then 200, and then 225, and you can see their progress. But if you don't have access to that, I would say, make a goal to start off to try and hit a green in regulation and one more. So green in regulation plus 1. Try and hit par 3s in 2 shots instead of 1. Try and hit par 4s in 3 shots instead of 2, and try and hit par 5s in 4 shots instead of 3. And so it doesn't make sense to think about greens in regulation when you can't reach the green
Yeah.
in regulation. So I recommend, like I said, if you don't have access to stroke gain, doing something like greens in regulation +1, and make it as your goal, as your mindset. Okay, this par 3, I want to get the ball on the green in 2 strokes, and then if I sink the putt, fine. If I 2-putt, that's okay. So your goal there is 4 or less, and that works pretty well if you're a junior golfer, if you're shooting over 90, to have a more realistic benchmark.
But I mean that the other thing there is you can divide the game up into sort of skill sets. So they don't just go, oh, I'm rubbish at this. You can quantify. You lose this number of shots, and
Yeah,
you
yeah,
gain.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
from when you're talking to a player, you can quantify the number of shots they're actually losing or gaining at any point in time. And what you said there, you could do every single shot.
Yes, absolutely. And it's amazing how kids this doesn't bother them like it does adults. If you say, look, compared to a scratch golfer, you're losing 25 strokes. I can imagine adults would say, oh man, I don't want to hear that. But for kids, it's actually so fun because their goal is next year to only lose 20, and the year after that to only lose 15, and the year after that to only lose 10 strokes. And you can see this remarkable, consistent progress. Like I said, you can't reach a par 4 in 2 shots. You hit a driver, you hit a fairway wood, you hit you hit a 5-iron, whatever. That's fine. You'll see your strokes gain for each category of shots, and you start tracking this, and it's really fun to see how fast juniors improve.
And the measure comes from the distance that you're hitting from, or from the club you're hitting?
From the distance that you're hitting from. So that's sort of the key, because as you get longer, if you just measure how well am I hitting my 7-iron, and you start off hitting the iron from 70 yards, from 90 yards, and then from 110 yards, then it's really hard to see, are you making progress or not. So you want to measure how well are you hitting it, even how far away you are, not what club you're hitting. Another example might be, you could be 150 yards into the wind and you hit a 5-iron, and you have 150 yards downwind and you're hitting a 9-iron. You don't want to call one a 5-iron shot and the other a 9-iron shot. So I think it's better, and also there's elevation changes and all sorts of other things that come into play. So I think it's better to do things based on distance than based on club.
Yeah, and the thing there is, if you've got 150 yards into the wind, and you're hitting, like you said, 5-iron, and it's blowing a gale, and the pins took back left or something, and then you've got 150 yards downhill, 9-iron, pins in the middle, they seem quite different shots, even though they're the same distance.
Absolutely, and I say that's one of the deficiencies of strokes gained, is you really want to say how difficult is that shot, and it's pretty hard to put in all of that information. It would be the data entry would be horrendous if you put that in, and the comparison really is how much better are you doing compared to fairways, greens, and putts.
Yeah.
Strokes gained is measuring things in terms of tenths.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you're not taking into account that, the wind is howling on this particular shot, and it's going to be off by a little bit for sure, but it's going to be off by a tenth or two. It's not going to be off by 2 strokes, like when you hit it out of bounds versus not.
And Mark, how does it work then when you're round the green hitting different chip shots and things? Because obviously, a bit like the fairway, 150 yards, you could have missed the green by 2 foot and be in deep Bermuda on the edge of, Pebble Beach's 17, and you could miss the green, 10 yards on a links course and have a bump and run, that would be a much easier shot. Does it relate anything to shot, or just the distance
Yeah.
you are from the pin and how far away you finish?
Yeah. So ideally, strokes gained would measure every shot relative to its true difficulty. And because that's so hard, and we don't sort of have the data, and the data entry would be so hard, we're not distinguishing between you're 15 yards away in easy rough versus 15 yards away in deep rough. But clearly that matters. But if you play similar courses all the time, then that benchmark is kind of the same. Where it matters is if you're comparing one person playing on a course which has light rough, and then they move somewhere else where it has really deep rough, and then they move somewhere else. So to give you an idea, I talked with Phil Kenyon a bunch, and he would ask, because strokes gained putting when the PGA Tour does it is relative to the field average that day, to take out issues like were the greens bumpy, were the greens particularly easy to putt, something like that. And so if you adjust everything relative to the field, you're losing the fact that some 8-foot putts are harder than this 50% make rate, and some are easier than that. So he would always want to know, well, how much easier or more difficult than average was, this course in this round. And so if you take a look, the extremes are about a half a stroke, meaning if you look at the pros at Pebble Beach, say, Poa Annua, sort of bumpy greens, they might have a half a stroke, half a putt more compared to the benchmark than at a typical PGA Tour course. A half a stroke. It's not 1, 2, or 3 strokes different.
Okay.
That's an extreme. Most are, 2/10 or 3/10 of a stroke, a little bit easier, a little bit harder. So the differences sort of, one, aren't that big. They tend to even out, but if you're playing on a certain type of course day in and day out, well, it's pretty easy to measure your progress relative to that. But does that sort of answer your question a little bit? It would be better, like I said, if you knew exactly how tough the shot was, but that's hard.
Yeah, well, I can appreciate it. It'd almost be impossible. But when you look at putting statistics, and I always think putting statistics are always very interesting. When you look at the putting stats and the ability to gain shots on the green, what sort of ranges are we knocking, or creating that big gain? Is it knocking in mid-length putts that give you more strokes gained?
Yeah, interesting question. I really like that. The best putters gain most of their strokes from 3 to 10 feet. It's the short ones, 3 to 10 feet. They certainly gain, from 10 to 20 feet. And occasionally there's people that gain outside of 20 feet, but it's usually not much. So in practicing putting, it's important to practice, I think, all distances. But if you want to know where do the best putters gain the most strokes, the answer is 3 to 10 feet. It's the short ones. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is, even at 5 feet, there's a significant difference in skill. The best putters might sink 5% more putts from 5 feet than the average tour putter. You say, well, 5% doesn't sound like a lot. It is a lot. And so, I don't know, maybe in the UK you're not so much baseball fans.
No. No baseball over here.
But if I told you one baseball player had a 250 batting average and another baseball player had a 300 batting average, they would go, wow, that's a big difference. Well, that's 5%. 25% versus 30%.
Yeah.
That's 5%, and it's a huge difference in baseball. If you want to look at it in strokes gain terms in golf, 5% is a 20th of a shot. And if you could be 5% better on 18 holes with your putting, you've gained almost a shot. and gaining 1 stroke in your putting compared to PGA Tour average is big.
Yeah.
That's a lot. So one is going back to the 3 to 10 foot range. One is there's significant skill differences at all of those distances from 3 to 10 feet. And the other is how many of those shots do you have? The answer is you have a lot more 3 to 10 footers than you do 10 to 20 footers than you do 20 feet and outside. So it's a combination of skill differences and the number of putts. So you can have a 5-footer because you hit your approach shot to 5 feet. You could have a 5-footer because you're in the greenside bunker and you hit it to 5 feet. Or you could be 40 feet away and you hit your putt to 5 feet. There's a lot of ways to have a 5-foot putt. So it matters if you could be at all of those footers. If you're better at your, you can't get as much.
So
Another way to say this for people that like to count things is the best putters 1 putt more often. It's not that they 3-putt less often. So I think it's more important for players to track 1 putt than it is to worry about 3 putts.
So if you put 5 footers and we're gaining just a small margin from knocking it in, are we losing the same margin if we miss it?
Oh, no, you're missing a ton.
Yeah,
so,
do you know what I mean? Because
no,
the gain might be 0.1 or whatever, but the loss of missing it could be far greater.
Yeah, so I would look at it as if you had 10 8-foot putts, you're going to be tour average if you sink 5 out of 10. If you could sink 6 out of 10, you're a stroke better because you turned 1 miss into a make. And that miss lost a half, the make gains a half. So turning 1 miss into a make gains a stroke. So if you sink 6 out of 10 8-footers instead of 5 out of 10 8-footers, you're a stroke better. So that's, I would sort of, you know, look at it that way. 1 more 1-putt out of 10 of these opportunities from 8 feet will gain you a stroke.
Do you think it's possible to set up a practice routine which gave you a realistic strokes gained?
Yes. So I have a couple of those things in the Every Shot Counts book where, you know, you hit putts and you get points for sinking a putt, fewer points if you missed it, but you go beyond the hole. So that's one way to do it. What I recommend, sorry to make a plug here. So I have this app called Golf Metrics. There's a free trial, Android, iOS, whatever. So what I recommend for people to do is use an app like that to record your putting, and it will give you strokes gained. And you could just say, okay, I'm going to play 9 holes, and I'm going to track my putts, and you'll get strokes gained from various distances. So one of the advantages of doing that is, you know, it will break down your stroke gain. How well are you doing on long putts, medium putts, and short putts? So it gives you not only the total, but it gives you a breakdown. And then you can see over time, am I getting better or not? So you can play this game, you know, when you practice your putting, instead of just, you know, knocking putts around. At some point, you have this challenge. I'm going to play a 9-hole putting contest and record it, and then see how your strokes gained progresses over time. So I think those are the sort of the 2 ways to do it. One is a points-based system, and the other is just do strokes gained.
Now, the other thing you said a minute ago, Mark, was the best players in the world were great ball strikers. So when you say great ball strikers, is that relative to the distance they're hitting in from? And still getting it close. Is there because there must be, with the way courses are and things now, that there must be a certain distance where that you could gain more shots on the field. You know, are we talking that if you can hit it close from, say, 200 yards, that's where you're going to make the biggest gain on the field?
Yeah, the biggest gain for PGA Tour pros is 150 to 225, 150 to 225. And then say, if you want to answer your question directly, that is the area. More than putting, more than around the green, more than driving, 150 to 225 yards for PGA Tour pros. For amateur golfers, I'd say 100 to 200 yards. Almost the same thing, but maybe a little bit closer. 100 to 200 yards for amateur golfers is where, if you want to go from 90 to 80, that's the most important area to focus on, is approach shots. And within this broad category of approach shots, for amateurs, I'd say 100 to 200 yards. And for scratch golfers, tour pros, I'd say it's a little bit longer, closer to 150 to say 225. Might be a better range.
Do you think if we were to take somebody who's on the PGA Tour, let's say, and somebody who's in Europe, we'd have the Challenge Tour. In the US, it'd be the web.com. What's the biggest difference between a player who plays on the PGA Tour and somebody on the lower tour?
Oh, it's definitely, again, it varies by individual, but approach shots, that's the answer, because most of the players these days on web.com, and I'm sure on the Challenge Tour as well, they're strong. They hit the ball far. It's generally not distance. It's I would say approach shots. Those ranges is sort of the biggest differentiator. And it's if you take a look at amateurs versus pros from 150 yards, from 100, I have to remember exactly what the ranges are. But let's say PGA Tour pros hit half their shot inside of 20 feet from the hole from 150 yards, the other half outside of 25 feet. So 25 feet, half are inside, half are outside. For a golfer who's shooting 90, it's more like 55 feet.
Yeah.
It's more than twice as far. So getting that shot pattern at 150 yards, just bringing it in a little bit, is going to gain you a lot of stroke. And the reason is people sort of misunderstand that if a PGA Tour pro has a shot pattern that has a 25-foot width and they reduce it to 20 feet, well, they usually two-putt from 25 feet and they two-putt from 20 feet. Doesn't seem like there's much difference. And that's not the way to think about it. If your pattern has a whole bunch of balls within 25 feet, and now you squeeze it in so that it's within 20 feet, it's not the 25-footer that becomes 20 feet. It's the 10-footer that becomes 5 feet. And it's the 8-footer that becomes 3 feet. That's where you gain the strokes, because you make so many more of those putts inside of 5, 8, and 10 feet. So the approach shot set up the putt, and you can be an average putter, and you're going to gain a whole lot because your approach shot pattern is just a wee bit tighter. For amateurs, if you can take that from 55 feet and make it 45 or make it 40 feet, you'll gain a ton of strokes over the long term.
The other thing I like about it is that you can always reduce it. There's a measure, isn't there? You can always be trying to do a foot closer, and you'll never complete the task because you'll never
right.
hold them all.
That's right.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely right. Yeah.
That you can always progress in each area, and I think from a coach's perspective, you have a score for each skill set of the game.
Yep. If you're working on a player on their putting, say, and their average score is 80, and then a week later they shoot a couple of 80s, and it looks like they're not making progress. Well, it could be that they hit one drive out of bounds, but their putting was 2 strokes better, and that's why they shot the same score, but their putting actually was getting better because of what the two of you were working on together. So I think it's really helpful to break down your score into these different strokes gained categories and see, where are you making progress? Where do you need to put in some more work?
Yeah, I've never read the book, but I know the stuff because people have told me about it and showed me the data. And I really like it. And I think, through certainly this season, I'm going to have to get, a few of the players to get on it and look at it. I remember a couple of lads who played on tour who showed me their record from the PGA, from the European Tour, and it got all their strokes gained per week from the data. And you could basically go, oh, well, in month one, you made X amount of money, right? But you gained that number of shots. You haven't been gaining the same number of shots further down the field or in the next couple of months for whatever reason. And I think it helps you shape not only the game, but shapes their practice.
Absolutely. I figure, if it's good enough for Rory McIlroy and others, I think it should be good enough for amateurs and junior golfers. There's some great quotes from Rory McIlroy. He uses the strokes gain analysis to decide how to tailor his practice. And he's not the only one. Many golfers do. And so if it's good enough for Rory McIlroy, wouldn't it be good enough for you?
Oh, well, you'd hope so, wouldn't you?
Having said that,
I know some juniors who'd always like to argue the fact. But what do you think's been the biggest gain for the player? Is it the scoring component of it?
I'm not sure. What's the context for that question? What do you mean exactly?
When strokes gains come out, and obviously it's changed the statistics quite dramatically. What do you think's been the biggest gain from a player's perspective to have those numbers? Is it just a measure, or do you think it really helped their progress?
Yeah, I think number one is individual players can focus on their weaknesses, and they can measure things better, which helps them decide where to practice. So I think that's one goal. And if I think one implication and one finding, or one result, I guess, I've had a number of college coaches say, we've changed how we practice because, what we heard before was, it's all about this, or it's all about putting, or it's all about, lag putting or something like that. Now we spend a lot more time on our approach shot play. And it really restructured, the time spent. Just beating drivers for 2 hours, even if driving is important, maybe you can't gain so much. Around the green shots, maybe in total, there's not so much, there's not as much to gain, but there's so many, you're talking about different lies, different conditions, just to maintain or improve might take you more practice time because there's so many different shots to practice. But still focusing on approach shots in this range, 100 to 225 yards, I think has opened a lot of people's eyes. It was the hardest area to measure. If you look at fairways, greens, and putts, how do you measure approach shots with that? Not very well. And Tiger Woods, throughout his career, obviously one of the greatest players ever, gains most of his strokes with his approach shots and has consistently throughout his career. That's been his number one weapon. And the reason he's Tiger Woods, he's also been a good driver. He's also been good around the green. He's also been a really good putter. But his approach shots really separated him from everybody else. Brilliant.
Now, Mark, we've had an hour. They're going to kick us off in 1 minute, as they do every time I come out. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and have a chat. I think it's great. I just love the concept, and I'll get some of the loads of them onto the strokes gained and see how we can move them forward from a practice perspective, as well as get them to understand their own games and where they are actually losing shots and gaining shots.
Well, one piece of advice is that it really helps to have a good coach like yourself. So I'd say, listen to the coach.
I'm going to screen that one. No, that's brilliant, Matt. It's been fabulous speaking to you tonight. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on and having a chat. It's been brilliant. Thanks, Mark.